I'm here today with Nigel Lee, Executive Director of Astoistic. Nigel, thanks for your time.
No, thank you very much, Dave.
Could you explain a little bit of the background to the company and some of the work that's gone into getting it to this point?
Yeah, so Dave, the company's really been formed over a 4-year period. Started off with a concept by the founders who were looking at trying to find a way to use mobile phones to enable donation-based giving. And it's really had a huge amount of activity and investment through that period. Took us to the point whereby we RTO'd in May and raised about $6 million to be able to take the platform that had already been developed through to the next stage. The platform itself was trialled in the UK at the end of last year and had some extraordinary results because of just the simplicity of being able to add a small amount donated and do that on your mobile phone bill. Ultimately, the platform has probably got some of the largest scalability of really anything I've been involved in the payment space, because it doesn't rely on normal payment tools. It doesn't rely on credit cards, doesn't really need you to have KYC, know your customer, doesn't need you to be able to sign up with complicated forms, and yet it allows you as a donor and it allows beneficiaries to be able to have an interaction of donation on a repeatable basis for small amounts of money.
And in terms of the market for this type of product and platform, how do you measure the market?
Well, measuring the market's always tough. I mean, I think if you want to, one measure of it is to go and look in somewhere like the US, where you have 250 million mobile phones today. And if you think about the fact that this industry sector is largely offline today, so by some measure it's somewhere in the region of between 95 and 98% offline currently, then it's actually untouched. The donating spectrum is untouched by modern technologies. So you have 250 million phones, and yet whilst those devices could be used to be able to make donations, actually today a tiny portion of donations are made through the phone platform. So that's one measure. I think the other measure is simply the scale of the industry of donating itself. Today in the US, the industry is over $350 billion that is being donated. Now, as I said earlier, that's 90% offline. So the ability to be able to mobilize 250 million people, or a portion of them, to be giving a small amount of money, perhaps $5 on average per month, and doing that on a regular monthly basis through this platform, means you're able to raise $500 billion of an industry simply by getting 5% of that market space. So it is a massive market.
And in terms of the cost of donation, which is always something that I think non-for-profit groups struggle with and try to reduce as much as possible, I believe that's probably a competitive advantage to you.
Well, it absolutely is. And I think one of the lesser known facts, until you start to be involved in an industry sector like this, is that not only is it complicated to be able to donate, as I explained earlier, but actually the cost of raising $1 is extremely high for just about every charity. And so the average cost in one of the studies in the US was that 68% of the funds being raised were used to raise funds. That's an awful efficiency ratio. There are stories, all of us will know about them, where people have it's actually cost them more money to raise funds than the funds that they've raised. And that's not uncommon. This particular platform is very transparent. 15% is the cost of running the platform for us. 85% minimum goes through to the charity. And that means that the charity can use this as really not only a repeat mechanism, which is something that the charities themselves don't really have today, but it's also the lowest cost of them being able to raise funds that most charities have available to them. So it's really very attractive for the charities.
And what's the interest been like from non-for-profit charity groups, both here in Australia and also globally?
Well, I think that two areas of interest that have been really important for the non-for-profit groups. And the first area of interest has been the ability to be able to raise funds at such a low cost, and to do so in a repeatable way. And actually not two, probably three. The second area of interest has actually been the ability to use modern technologies to be able to do that, and as a result reach out to an audience that in many cases they just can't touch today. But the third piece that has been as important, I think, as raising the funds themselves has actually been the ability for charities through this mechanism to be able to reach out and provide news updates and touch consumers who have donated, get them engaged on an ongoing basis, and actually get them to be able to share that in a social way with the communities that they're involved with. So for that reason, what we're seeing is great interest in all of the geographies we talk to charities about this.
And in terms of milestones that investors should be looking for going forward, what sort of milestones are you placing publicly on the business?
Well, I think there are a few milestones that are important to understand about the business. I think the first milestone is that it is always the case or very often the case in technology-based stories, that you have to wait for getting numbers of users, and then there's a discussion about the monetization of those users over time. Actually, the first important point about this particular business model is that someone donating equals revenue to the company immediately. And that's a very different model from the social media model or some of the other models that I think in the tech space are being talked about today. So that's important. So from that, the first measure is really being able to understand our numbers of people who are beginning to donate. But the precursor to that is really being able to see charities that are onboarded into the app, that have relevant both status in the industry and coverage in terms of media scope, and also scale in terms of the current funds they raise, and impact with consumers. I mean, one of the reasons in the US why we chose the Veterans Call vertical was because not only is it an incredibly important vertical to be able to support, but it has such a huge amount of media coverage that the ability for us to use that to be able to support the app in conjunction with the charities becomes enormous. So the milestones, I think, will revolve around both signings of charities. They'll revolve around agreements with endorsers and celebrities to be able to support particular causes. They'll involve realizing numbers. The major component will be realizing numbers of donors that are actually on the platform, using the platform. And I think investors will be able to draw a very straight line between some of those, both announcements as well as some of the metrics, to revenue and support within the company.
How important is it for events such as this for investors to understand not just the metrics and the finances and the investment proposition being offered by a platform such as this, but also the non-for-profit opportunities that they have as investors to support going forward as well?
Well, you know, it is interesting. This plays, I think, on so many different levels. First of all, these sorts of events are definitely allowing us to ensure that we can talk to investors in a meaningful way. I mean, I talk about this in a simple soundbite in two components. One, this is really giving for the 21st century. It is using modern technologies to be able to start and change the philanthropic process. In addition to that, though, it is for profit, for good. So, you know, it's a bit early to suggest to people that this is an ethical investment, but actually it really is. And the company itself is beginning to enter a market space whereby it can feel good, and I think investors can feel good about being able to support this space. Also, I think on the flip side, understanding that there is a very large trend in the US and elsewhere for corporate social responsibility and for individual social responsibility. And it's that trend combined with the technology components that enable us to do this that I think becomes a very, very attractive space for people to be able to become involved in.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time.
No, my pleasure, David.